What are you doing? I accompanied my stepmother, who has trouble walking, to a party at her request. While I stepped away, she had champagne poured over her by a stranger. Ha, sitting around comfortably at my standing party just because you claim to have bad legs? I don't care about that. Apparently, he was the CEO of the company hosting this party. If I recall correctly, his name was Mr. Kennedy. I think it's completely inappropriate for a company CEO to act this way. How arrogant. Well, commoners like you probably can't afford expensive champagne, so consider yourself lucky to wear it on your head. As he laughed hysterically, I glared at him, and he glared right back. What's with that face? You're just the son of a subcontractor. Subcontractors are nothing. Get lost. He even made a dismissive shooing gesture at me. At that moment, I snapped. I decided I would never forgive Mr. Kennedy for pouring champagne on my mother and for saying such things. I'll make sure to get you fired first. What? What happened next was the beginning of his descent into hell. My name is David. I'm a 35-year-old bachelor. Even though I'm busy with work every day, I always keep my Friday nights free. That's the time I spend having dinner with my mother. Mom, did I keep you waiting? Sorry about that. No, David, I just got here myself. She smiled and looked up at me in front of the restaurant. My mother, Catherine, turned 55 this year. Her face had more wrinkles now, but her kind eyes hadn't changed, and she still carried her cane in her right hand. She was born with a disability in her legs, so her cane is an essential part of her daily life. But the truth is, she's not my biological mother. Let me start from the beginning. When I was old enough to remember, I was living with just my father. I went to daycare, and most of the time, it was mothers who came to pick up the other kids. But for me, it was always my father, arriving late after work in his suit. My friends naturally talked about their moms. But I couldn't even imagine what having a mother was like. Dad, why don't I have a mom? When I asked him that, he looked pained and said, I'm sorry, David. I'm so sorry. Seeing his expression, I could sense something was wrong, and I couldn't bring myself to ask further. When I was about 5, I learned from my grandmother that my biological mother had abandoned me and my father right after I was born. She had run off with another man. I had suspected as much, but knowing that my own mother had forsaken me left a scar on my heart. When I had been in elementary school for a little while, my father approached me nervously. David, there's someone I'd like you to meet. Someone you want me to meet. That's when he introduced me to a woman named Catherine. At the time, my father was about 35 years old, the same age I am now. Catherine was 27. David, I'm thinking of marrying Catherine here. She'll be your mother. Is that okay with you? I was taken aback. It wasn't surprising, considering I had never had a mother in my life, and suddenly, I was being told I'd have one. There was also something I was curious about. Why do you use a cane, miss? Looking back, it was rude to ask that question right off the bat. But back then, I was just a little kid. Nice to meet you, David. I was born with a disability in my legs. I can walk with a cane, though. Would you mind having a mother like me? Catherine spoke with a hint of uncertainty, but I shook my head. No, I'm happy to have a mom. Great. If David is okay with it, let's shake hands to say, looking forward to living together from now on, but. We shook hands. I remember how soft and warm her hand felt. After that, my father brought me to meet Catherine a few more times. Each time, she made me homemade snacks or helped me with my studies. I grew fond of her and gradually found myself talking to her more easily. 6 months after we met, my father and Catherine got married. It was my father's second marriage, but Catherine's first. They worked at the same company, which is how they met. Catherine didn't want a lavish wedding, so they simply took a commemorative photo instead. Even as a child, I was struck by how beautiful Catherine looked in her wedding dress. That photo of the three of us as a family is still displayed on my desk today. My father, smiling warmly, Catherine, with a shy expression, and me, in my school uniform, looking a little nervous. It's a happy family photo. The three of us started living together. For a while, I called Catherine Miss instead of Mom. It felt a bit awkward and embarrassing to call her Mom at first. Neither she nor my father pressured me about it. Catherine continued working while also taking care of the household. She was especially skilled at cooking, and for me, who had been eating my dad's limited menu, her meals were like a dream come true. Miss, can I have seconds on the hamburger steak? Of course. I'm so happy you like it. She always smiled kindly, and I gradually opened up to her. I even started talking to her about what was happening at school. A little over a year after Catherine came into our lives, Mother's Day came around at school. We had a class project to draw a picture for our mothers and give it to them as a gift. I worked hard to draw Catherine's smile. I also wrote, "Thank you, Mom." But I felt a bit nervous about giving it to her. Would she be happy with it? I put the drawing in my backpack and went home. While I hesitated, Catherine noticed something was up. "David, what's wrong? Do you have something you want to tell me?" Here. Mom, thank you for everything." When I handed Catherine the drawing, her eyes widened. Then, tears began to stream down her face in large drops. "You're calling me Mom? I'm so happy, thank you." Overwhelmed with emotion, she pulled me into a hug. "Can I call you Mom from now on?" "Of course." My dad watched us with a joyful smile. My dad was there, and my mom was there. I was happy with that life. Dad continued to shower me with affection, and Catherine, no, Mom, supported me with care and discipline when I needed it. I cherished this ordinary family life more than anything. However, that simple happiness didn't last long. One day, my father suddenly collapsed at work. Mom, who worked at the same company, rode with him in the ambulance to the hospital. But he had suffered a heart attack, and by the time they arrived at the hospital, it was too late. Dad. When I was brought to the hospital, I saw my father lying there with a white cloth covering his face. His hands were cold, and no matter how much I talked to him, he wouldn't wake up. Behind me, Mom was crying uncontrollably. Thus, my father suddenly became someone who would never return. From the time I was born, he protected me and even raised me alone for several years. Losing him left me in a daze. Even during his funeral, everything felt unreal. The only thing I clearly remember is Mom holding my hand tightly the entire time. After the funeral, it was just me, my grandmother on my father's side, and Mom. Grandma liked Mom. I didn't fully understand it at the time, but they seemed to get along well. That boy left us far too soon, but I'm sure he was happy in those last few years with you, Catherine. Hearing this, Mom began to cry again. As for what comes next, I think I'll take David. Catherine, you're not his biological mother, and you're still young. You can find your own happiness without burdening yourself. You don't have to push yourself. I looked down. It was true that Mom wasn't my real mother. But if I started living with Grandma, I'd have to change schools, and more than that, I'd be separated from Mom. We'd be strangers again. The thought made my heart ache. Sensing my distress, Mom gently squeezed my hand. No, Mother. I'll raise David. Both Grandma and I looked at her in surprise. But Catherine, your legs aren't strong, and you might struggle financially. There may be times when you feel like David is a burden. Are you really sure about this? Yes. I decided on the day David called me Mom for the first time. I decided that I would always protect him and be his mother for life. It's true that it might be hard at times, but it's for my precious son. For his sake, I'll give him all the love he deserves. Even the love of his father, and raise him to be a fine young man. So, could you please trust me with David? Her words carried an unshakable resolve. Tears streaming down her face, and Grandma asked, Catherine, are you truly okay with this? Will you think of David as your real son? Of course. He is my one and only son. I looked up at Mom's face. She turned to me and asked, David, is that okay? Will you keep living with me? Tears rolled down my cheeks as I nodded. The warmth of her words, calling me her son, melted the ice that had formed in my heart after losing Dad. Yeah. I want to stay with you, Mom. I'll help out a lot and be a good boy. So please, let me stay with you. David. As we cried together, Grandma looked at Mom and said, When you need anything, don't hesitate to tell me. I'll help however I can. Catherine, please take good care of David. And just like that, I continued living with my mother after my father's death. Mom must have been devastated by the loss of my father. She must have felt lonely and unsure of herself. But she never showed those tears in front of me. Instead, she tried to maintain the same warm and enveloping smile as always. Mom decided to keep her job in accounting while raising me on her own. Every morning, she would wake up early to prepare breakfast for me before heading to work. Since I got home earlier than she did, I tried my best to help with the housework to lighten her load. Whenever I helped out, Mom would smile warmly and say, Oh, David, you did the laundry? That makes me so happy, thank you. I wanted to see that smile, so I worked hard to help her. I grew older and eventually became a middle school student. Some kids rebel during adolescence. But I never had such a phase. I never forgot my gratitude toward Mom, and that kept me from ever wanting to rebel. Mom earned a steady salary as a full-time employee, but life was never easy for the two of us. We often went grocery shopping together or grew vegetables and planters to make ends meet. Mom, thanks for another amazing meal. This beef stew is the best. Thank you, David. Hearing you say that always keeps me motivated. When the exam season came, I earned a scholarship to the best high school in the region. Mom was overjoyed and proudly said, You're my wonderful son. After starting high school, I got permission to work a part-time job. I wanted to make life a little easier for Mom. David, I'm grateful you're working part-time, but remember, your main responsibility is to study. I'd rather you focus on your education and not worry about me. Hearing her concerns, I made sure my grades didn't slip. I managed to maintain the top rank in my grade for 3 years straight. It wasn't easy, of course, but when I thought about the sacrifices Mom had made, it felt manageable. Finally, my senior year arrived. David, you haven't told me much about your plans after high school. What are you planning to do? One day, Mom asked me this question, and I answered. Well, I'm thinking of becoming a civil servant after graduation. I'll probably pass the exam, so don't worry. Wait. David, you've never mentioned wanting to be a civil servant before. Is that what you really want? Not exactly. I just want to become independent as soon as possible. Being a civil servant means stable income, and I could help you out more. Right? Mom's eyes widened. And then her voice turned sharp. David! Sit down right now. Huh? Okay. It was rare for Mom to show anger, but at that moment, she clearly was. I nervously sat and looked up at her. David, children should never hold back for the sake of their parents. Your teacher told me you're an outstanding student who can get into any college. Don't you really want to go to college? I hesitated. The truth was, I did want to go to college and study something I was passionate about. But that would mean living on my own and paying for tuition, which I knew would be a huge financial burden. But college costs too much, and I don't want to. I know you're thinking about me, and I appreciate that. But don't forget that I think about you just as much as your mother. Mom left the room and came back with a bank book, placing it in front of me. This is your father's inheritance. I've kept it untouched all these years. What? Inside the bank book was a savings balance of several tens of thousands of dollars. David, I've been saving money for your college education as well. With this inheritance and my savings, you'll be able to go to college. So please, go when you want to attend. That's the wish of both your mom and your dad in heaven. Mom spoke with tears in her eyes. Mom, are you really sure about this? Of course I'm sure. David, make your mom proud. Thank you, Mom, thank you so much. I'll never forget this kindness. Mom smiled warmly and said, kindness? That's such an exaggeration. From that point on, I threw myself into my studies and was accepted into one of the top colleges in the country. When I started college, I left home to live on my own. On the day I moved out, Mom looked at me with deep emotion and said, David, you've grown so much. Mom, when we first met 11 years ago, you were so small. And now you've grown into such an impressive young man, leaving the house. It makes me a little sad, but there's nothing that makes me prouder. Do your best at college and stay true to yourself. My chest swelled with emotion as I said, Mom, I'll come back often. When I do, let me have some of your cooking, okay? Of course. I'll make your favorite hamburger steak anytime. With that, I began living apart from Mom and worked hard at my studies. During my time at college, I found myself torn about a new challenge. While it would have been safer to aim for a job at a major company or a stable career in public service, I had developed a dream I wanted to pursue. When I brought this up during one of my visits home, Mom told me, of course you should go for it. David, you only live once. You have the strength and talent to make your dreams come true. Take the chance. I'll always be your biggest supporter. Her words gave me the courage to commit to my dream. Looking back, Mom had always been my greatest ally, always believing in me. The fact that she chose to take me in after my father passed away. And the fact that she dedicated the rest of her life entirely to me. I could never thank her enough. Because of her, I had been able to keep moving forward with all my strength. Time passed, and I became a working adult. Although Mom and I lived separately, we stayed within visiting distance. We made it a habit to have dinner together every Friday. This is the story of the path Mom and I have walked together. It's been 28 years since we first met. Even now, Mom and I share a close bond. Over dinner one Friday, Mom said, David, there's going to be a work-related party soon. Really? That's rare for you. Mom currently works as the head of accounting at a small company. It's the same company she worked at when she met Dad. Her long years of dedication had been recognized, leading to her promotion. All department heads and above are invited. It's hosted by the company we contract with, and they said we can bring family if we're attending alone. David, would you come with me? Are you sure it's okay for me to go? I want to secretly show you off to my colleagues. I want them to see how amazing my son has become. Mom said with a playful wink. If you put it that way, I'll gladly join you. When's the party? Next Sunday. Thanks for agreeing. And so, we made plans to attend the party, and I returned to my place. On the day of the party, I arrived at the venue. In front of the entrance, Mom stood in an elegant party dress, alongside a man in a suit. Sean, it's been a while. David, you've grown into such an admirable man. Sean was Mom's supervisor, the managing director of her company. I'd heard he had been one of Dad's junior colleagues. After Dad passed away, Sean had been a significant source of support for Mom as she chose to continue working at the company. I trusted Sean. Thank you for always looking after my mother. Well, I just worry about her with her leg condition. Mom pouted playfully and said, I told you I'm fine, but you're such a worrywart. Sorry about that. But now that David's here, I don't have to worry anymore. Sean and Mom seemed close. I had long suspected that Sean, a bachelor, had feelings for my mother. Mom also seemed happy whenever she talked about him, and I wondered if they had mutual feelings for each other. However, I believed their lack of progress might have been because they were being considerate of me. Out of respect for Mom's decisions, I had never interfered in their relationship. But deep down, I hoped things would work out between them. As we entered the party venue, the lively standing buffet was just getting started. Sean guided Mom to a seat in a quiet corner of the room, where she sat down. "I'll grab us some drinks." I said that and went to the drink section to grab 3 glasses of white wine. While there, I also picked up some light snacks like cheese and olives. As I returned to where Mom and Sean were seated, I noticed from a distance that someone was standing in front of them. It was a middle-aged man, large in stature, dressed in an expensive-looking suit. To my shock, he dumped the contents of his champagne glass over Mom's head. "What are you doing?" I pushed my way through the crowd to reach them. Mom's hair was dripping wet, her bangs clinging to her face as water dripped down. Sean, who had been away for a moment, returned, his eyes wide in disbelief. "And who might you be?" "I'm her son." "Why on earth would you do something like this?" "Ha! Sitting comfortably at my standing party, acting like you own the place?" I don't care if she claims her legs are bad, that's no excuse. Apparently, this man was the CEO of the company hosting the party. His name was Mr. Kennedy. I was about to get up, but he poured the champagne before I could. My mother looks like she's about to cry. As a company CEO, don't you think this behavior is utterly inappropriate? What a cheeky little brat. Commoners like you probably can't afford this expensive champagne, so consider this an honor. As I glared at Mr. Kennedy, who was laughing loudly, he glared back at me. "What's with that face?" "You're just the son of a subcontractor." "Subcontractors are nothing but dust, blow them away, and they're gone. Now, get out of here." He even made dismissive shooing gestures. At that moment, I completely lost my temper. I made up my mind not to let Mr. Kennedy get away with pouring champagne on my mother and saying such cruel things. "Let's start with getting you fired." "What?" Mr. Kennedy exchanged glances with his entourage before bursting into laughter. "You think you can get me fired? Go ahead, try if you can, you little punk." His expression was full of arrogance and confidence. Without a word, I calmly took out my phone and dialed a number. "Hello, Mr. Kingston? It's me. Sorry to call you out of the blue, but I'm afraid we'll have to cancel this deal." "Yes, it's because of your CEO, Mr. Kennedy." He poured champagne over my mother and told her to get lost. After finishing the call, I hung up. Mr. Kennedy stood there, his mouth agape, staring at me. "Kingston? That's the name of our group's chairman." Almost immediately, his phone, tucked into his chest pocket, began ringing. "No. Mr. Kingston. That can't be." Mr. Kennedy fumbled and dropped his phone, his entire body trembling as he looked at me with fear in his eyes. "Oh, what's your name?" "My name is David. I'm the CEO of a company called D Corporation." When I said that, Mr. Kennedy's face turned pale as he opened his mouth. "D Corporation? You mean the giant IT company that just decided to partner with us?" "That D Corporation?" "Yes, that's correct." As I replied, the room erupted in murmurs. "Yes, I am currently the CEO of 20 multinational global companies. D Corporation grew tremendously in the IT sector and recently began selling smartphones and tablets worldwide. The manufacturing for those devices had been entrusted to the company led by Mr. Kennedy, which happened to be the primary contractor for my mother's company. Incidentally, this party was to celebrate the contract between D Corporation and Mr. Kennedy's company. I actually started my business during my college days. My mother gave me a push and supported me. Turning her support into motivation, I kept working hard and gradually grew Company D, which started as a small business, into something much bigger. And now, Company D has become a global corporation. As a company CEO, shouldn't you at least recognize the face of the CEO of a major client? I bent down to help wipe my mother's wet clothes as I said this to Mr. Kennedy. Why would someone like the CEO of D Corporation be here? I sighed deeply. I'm only here today to accompany my mother, who works for one of your subcontractors. Incidentally, I approved the deal with your company to ensure the profitability of my mother's company. Her company deals in essential components for smartphones and tablets. That said, this contract now seems to be in jeopardy. As I spoke calmly, Mr. Kennedy visibly trembled. I didn't know. I deeply apologize for the grave disrespect I showed to your mother. Please forgive me. But I stared coldly at Mr. Kennedy. As you can see, my mother has trouble walking. Without her cane, she cannot even stand. That's why she found a seat in the corner of the venue, as any reasonable person would. And yet, you noticed her and told her she was in the way, didn't you? My mother spoke up then. I explained that I have a disability. But he said, "What kind of company hires someone like you, and a company that employs a person like this must be terrible." Hearing this made my blood boil. Mr. Kennedy, you have no problem saying such things to someone with a disability? As a corporate CEO, or rather as a human being, your words are despicable. I now realize my decision was not a mistake. Mr. Kennedy stammered, I. Unable to form a coherent response. That's when Sean, an employee at the subcontractor, spoke up. Our company may be small, but we actively hire and support individuals with disabilities. In fact, Catherine does an excellent job here. Regardless of your position as the primary contractor, as a leader, it's unacceptable for you to speak to an employee that way. It must have taken great courage for Sean to stand up to the primary contractor. His words reassured me. I'm truly sorry. I deeply regret my actions, Mr. Kennedy said, bowing his head. But I spoke with anger etched on my face. Listen carefully. The person you mocked and poured champagne on is my one and only family. After my father passed away, she took me in as her own, even though I wasn't her biological son. She raised me with all her love and support. She's the one who has always been there for me. My mother, her eyes brimming with tears, whispered, "David." I put an arm around her shoulder and glared at Mr. Kennedy. And yet, you insulted her. I can never forgive you for that. You will take full responsibility. This deal is cancelled. This party was meaningless. The room was silent, and all eyes were on us. Mr. Kennedy's employees and affiliated company CEOs looked pale as they watched. Please, don't say that. Please forgive me. If this contract falls through, it'll be a devastating blow to our company. I beg you. Mr. Kennedy, with tears streaming down his face, dropped to his knees. And then, he bowed down to me in apology. Before apologizing to me, you should apologize to my mother, I said coldly. Mr. Kennedy turned to my mother and prostrated himself. I sincerely apologize for my disrespect, ma'am. Please, I beg you to convince your son not to terminate the contract. My mother responds firmly to Mr. Kennedy. I, too, am deeply offended by your actions. I have no intention of interfering with my son's decision. That can't be. Once again, I opened my mouth to speak. Since my mother says the same thing, I have no intention of changing my decision. At that moment, Mr. Kennedy clung to my legs. Please, anything but that. Feeling annoyed, I was about to shake him off when a commanding voice echoed from the entrance of the venue. That's enough, Kennedy. A chill ran through the room. Ah! Mr. Kingston. It was Mr. Kingston, the head of Mr. Kennedy's corporate group, whom I had spoken with on the phone earlier. Mr. Kingston approached us and bowed deeply. I sincerely apologize for the tremendous disrespect that our group's Mr. Kennedy has shown your mother. Mr. Kingston, nearing 80 years old, carried the authority befitting a leader of a major corporate group. There is no need for you, Mr. Kingston, to apologize on his behalf, I replied. Mr. Kingston shot a sharp glare at Mr. Kennedy. After discussions with the board, we've decided to dismiss Mr. Kennedy from his position as CEO. What? Ignoring Mr. Kennedy's shocked outburst, Mr. Kingston continued. This man has done nothing but flaunt his authority since becoming CEO, and he's been disliked by many. His dismissal is well deserved. We cannot ask you to continue the partnership, but I hope you'll accept my sincerest apology. Mr. Kingston bowed his head sincerely as he spoke. I looked at Mr. Kennedy and said, "Are you certain about dismissing him?" "Yes, I promise." Mr. Kennedy shouted in desperation. "Mr. Kingston, I don't want to be fired. I've worked so hard to reach this position." Silence. "It was my mistake to entrust someone like you with such responsibility. Leave this company immediately." The very words "leave" that Mr. Kennedy had spat at us earlier were now being hurled at him by Mr. Kingston. Defeated, Mr. Kennedy slumped to the floor in despair. "Mr. Kingston, if you can dismiss Mr. Kennedy, we will continue our business relationship. I sincerely look forward to working with you in the future. Your kindness knows no bounds." "I cannot thank you enough," Mr. Kingston replied, grasping my hand and bowing repeatedly. Then, turning to Mr. Kennedy, he barked, "Now, remove this man immediately." At his command, Mr. Kingston's aides dragged a protesting Mr. Kennedy out of the venue. My mother and I merely watched the scene unfold. Afterward, Mr. Kingston reorganized the event, and the party resumed. However, since my mother's clothes were drenched, I decided to take her home. As we exited the venue, every attendee bowed to us in respect. I gave Mr. Kingston a nod and left the venue with my mother and Sean. "Mom, that was a rough ordeal. Are you okay? You're not feeling cold, are you?" When I asked in the car, my mother smiled. "I'm fine, David. More than that, thank you for standing up for me." It really warmed my heart. Relieved by her words, I noticed Sean bowing his head toward me. "David, I'm sorry. If I hadn't taken my eyes off her, I could have protected your mother better." "Don't worry, Sean. You stood up for her, even though Mr. Kennedy was your superior. That took real courage." My mother also thanked Sean, but he seemed a little embarrassed, so I decided to tease him a bit. "By the way, Sean, what do you think of my mother?" "What?" "That's..." Though nearly 60, Sean's face turned bright red. "David, don't say such things." My mother's face also seemed slightly flushed. "Well, I'm a busy man, so I've been hoping someone could stay close and take care of her." "Sean, let me ask you again. What do you think of my mother?" Then Sean spoke clearly. "The truth is, I've thought of Catherine as someone very special for a long time." "Sean, but I've seen how hard Catherine worked after losing David's father, raising him with everything she had. I thought if I shared my feelings, it might shock or confuse her." I nodded at his words and turned to my mother. "There you have it, Mom. What's your answer to Sean?" My mother looks confused as she glances back and forth between Sean and me. She seems unsure of what to say. Sensing her hesitation, I spoke gently. "Mom, it's okay for you to be happy. Ha! You've done so much for me, always putting me first, always trying to be the best mother you could. But I'm okay now. It's your turn to find happiness. If you care about Sean, I want you to take his hand and be with someone who values you." My mother's eyes glistened with tears as she replied in a trembling voice. I also think of Sean as someone very dear to me. Sean, may I take your hand? Sean's face lit up with joy as he exclaimed, of course. I smiled as I watched the two of them clasp hands. This is what happened afterward. Mr. Kingston kept his promise and officially dismissed Mr. Kennedy from his position. Having been removed from the company, Mr. Kennedy became a shadow of his former self. It's said that he squandered his wealth during his tenure, leaving him with little savings. His wife divorced him, his children abandoned him. And now he lives alone, shut away in his home. It seems he'll spend the rest of his life in isolation, unable to find another job. Yet, I feel no sympathy for him. As for me, the Smartphones and Tablets D Corporation launched were a huge success, and the company continued to grow rapidly. I now travel the world as a busy CEO, overseeing our global operations. Despite my hectic schedule, I don't worry much about my mother. That's because Sean is by her side. The two of them got married, and my mother moved into Sean's apartment, where they now live together. Sean is completely devoted to her, which gives me great peace of mind. One day, while I was at work, my phone rang. David? How are you doing? I'm doing fine, Mom. Well, Sean and I are thinking of going to the US for our honeymoon. I'd love to see one of your company's offices while we're there. Of course. I'll take you to some of my favorite spots while you're here. Hearing that, my mother laughed happily. I'll always remember to be grateful to my mother and continue to live my life to the fullest.